Well, good morning. Beautiful Sunday morning out here. Just unfortunately, wind is absolutely howling. Found my microphones on the floor when I came back out from making my tropical iced coffee, and messed the what you call it, food coloring all over the place. Anyway, there's a couple of things going wrong already this morning, but that's all fine. It's just really a beautiful day out here. And welcome to Exodus through Ancient Eyes. Last week, or the last time we were on here, we had a bit of a chat on a couple of things that are quite important. So, for instance, we had a look at the Song of the Sea as an older version of the Exodus out of Egypt. This is found in Genesis 15, and then the prose version in Genesis 13 and 14. And we had a look at some of the implications that does have for us as readers from a modern perspective, and that we can see that there's some really old ideas in the song. And this is not just because we think so. We also know, linguists tell us, that the Song of the Sea has an older version of Hebrew in it. So we kind of know that it's older, and there's some slight mis-synchronizations with the prose version, which we would expect, and so forth and so forth. One of the things that really gets highlighted from the Song of the Sea is a very old view of what God is like from the perspective of the writers. So technically speaking, if we had to put a date on it, the Song of the Sea is probably like 500 to 600 years older than the version of the Exodus we have in our Bible. That is a very, very long time, and you would expect ideas about God and ideas about the Exodus itself to shift and drift over time, resulting in a newer version, an updated version. Normally, these type of literatures are updated for their current context and then reworked again when a new context arrives, or a new age arrives, really. All right, so one of the things we need to discuss from this, of course, is the way that the perspective on God changes throughout the Hebrew Bible. And I'll probably do a special little insert where we discuss that. So that'll be up and coming. We're in December now, so I might take a bit of an absence of leave for 2 or 3 weeks, but maybe just during the week at some point I'll just pop that in. It is incredibly insightful, and it is something that once you see it, you can never unsee it again. And this is the idea that the image of God, or the reputation of God as viewed and recorded by ancient Israelites, actually shift over time if you look at the Hebrew Bible in a chronological way. Just one caveat is that the chronological view of the Hebrew Bible is not defined by which book is first. A lot of scholarship has gone into this type of idea. In other words, we kind of know which books were written before the others, at least to some degree, and we need to take that into account when we deal with the chronology of the Hebrew Bible. Anyway, that's something which I think I'll delve into in another episode. For today, we'd like to get to Sinai. So this is a long journey, and so it was for them, so it's a great analogy, but we're trying to get to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, or alternatively called Horeb in some of the other doublet traditions, is the place where Moses met God in the first part of Exodus, when he goes to Midian, meets up with Jethro, marries his wife, and then he stumbles while shepherding out around Midian. If you know your geography, you'll know it's way over to the east. He stumbles on this mountain. He has this encounter with a bush, a fiery bush. This is where this God lives. This God makes himself known to Moses as Yahweh, or the Lord, as it is translated in our English Bibles. And this seems to be the place where this God lives. So that when Moses goes back to Egypt and brings the bunch of Israelites out, where does he take them? He takes them straight back to this mountain, because this is kind of where God lives. So there's a bit of discrepancy in terms of where this mountain actually finds itself, and we did cover this in the very early sessions. That some believe it's at the very bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, and that's kind of what this part we're about to engage assumes. but earlier part seems to assume that it's closer way east over to the Midian side in Arabia. And this is something that's also confirmed by Paul. So that makes it really an alluring little thing to have a look at. But it's not so straightforward as to actually where this mountain was. Putting that aside, the road to Sinai is incredibly important, because at Sinai is where this God, we'll call him Yahweh from now on, this is where he dwells. And he is the one that is pulling the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery and is calling them to be something special to him. Wow, this wind is really going for it today. This is the place where the law will come. This is the place where they will possibly for the first time meet the awe and the ferocity of this God, as it is demonstrated in thunder and lightnings and, you know, the typical kind of things that happened and at this on mountains. Anyway, so today we take that journey and we're going to have a look at, we're probably going to do this in a very short fashion, because we really want to get to Sinai. Because at Sinai, it seems like besides the coming out of Egypt and the plagues culminating in the death of the firstborn, the whole reason for the story being told by later Israelites is to kind of cement in place the temple order, the Levitical priestly order, and the law, the commandments, the ways in which the Israelites should live. And all of this kind of happens at Sinai. But as we should have come to expect by now, things don't happen in a chronological way here. We'll have a look today at how priests are mentioned before they are even instituted. No priesthood is instituted, but we have commands for the priests and so on. It's slightly disjointed. Moses goes up and down the mountain like someone like a little kid playing in an elevator at Gateway. That you really, at most of the time, you don't know where he is, because it seems that this kind of disjointness in the text, once again, is caused by the conflation of multiple traditions that get weaved together, causing a confusion sometimes about where Moses actually gets the 10 commandments and where he is at the point at which things happen. So we'll have a look at that a little bit. But let's just start with the most pressing problem the Israelites face on their journey towards Sinai. They're moving through a wilderness, and food and water is at the top of their priority list. These are problems that are very typical to the wilderness. The Israelites left with gold and silver, but they run into a problem that they don't have any food. Now, you can't eat gold and silver, but you do need food and water, and this becomes a pressing issue. And of course, they transfer all of that pressure back onto Moses, and Moses transfers all of that pressure back onto God. Water becomes a very important topic of discussion in the Sinai story, or in the Exodus story between Egypt and Sinai. There are three specific moments in which water is mentioned and becomes the topic of discussion. Let's go through them very quickly. The first occurs in a place called Mara, which means bitter. This is in the wilderness of Shur. There, after 3 days, no water. They find the water, but unfortunately it's bitter, and the Israelites start complaining. They seem to be really good at complaining, and I guess I would have been that good at complaining as well. If I was part of a party, I've just come out of Egypt, all these amazing things have happened, and I've got no water to drink. Surely God can do some magic trick and we can get some water going, you know? And that's exactly what happens. Moses goes, he consults with God. He's shown a piece of wood. He throws the piece of wood into the water, and the water becomes sweet and they can drink it. This is also reminiscent of the first plague, in which God made the waters of the Egyptians undrinkable. And here God has the reversibility to make undrinkable waters drinkable. And it is a sign to the Israelites, and of course to the later readers of the story, that God was with them even in the wilderness. And that would have been a lesson for the current Israelites, because the Israelites that existed or lived during the time of which this story was probably written down are most probably in exile or on their way back to Jerusalem. And it is supposed to be a lesson that as long as they obeyed God and followed God, possibly in this case make the journey back to Jerusalem, the promised land which they were promised, that God would supply for them as they moved. So they kind of had to move in faith And when they encountered problems, they don't have to worry, God was going to look after them. And it does seem to me, at least, and I think to many other scholars, that in fact these stories were written for Israelites in exile so that they would have the courage to go back to the land which God had given them. So they were kind of like analogous parables, if you want, stories to encourage the Israelites to keep on trusting God in their way back to the promised land. That's why a lot of people believe that these stories are not literal historical accounts, but they're kind of like parables to some degree. All right. So the second water story happens at the grand oasis of Elim in chapter 15, verse 27. There they stay for just under a month before heading out to the wilderness of Sin in chapter 16. Jumping ahead then to chapter 17, we get to a third story about water. They are camped at Rephidim, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and once again, no water to drink. Again, they quarrel with Moses, who again goes and complains to God. This time, the solution for Moses is now to take his staff. Now, this is the famous staff, which did some really strange magic tricks in Egypt. This staff he still has. He opened the Red Sea with it, and now it's still here, and it still has power. And this time he takes the staff, and let me just get back to what I'm saying here. He takes the staff, the same one used for the plagues, and he strikes the rock at Horeb. Now, Horeb is pretty close to Sinai, but the Israelites are still in this Rephidim. Now, these are quite far apart. So we're not sure what's supposed to happen here because Horeb is, or we're not sure what's going on here because Horeb is supposed to be an alternative name for Sinai, right? And this would mean that Moses and possibly some of the elders, they went ahead to Horeb, Sinai. There they will strike a rock and water will flow from that rock all the way back to Rephidim, which is, it's strange. And as I've said so many multiple times, I will say, keep on saying it because it's probably the biggest lesson to be learned from investigating the story of Exodus is that the conflation of multiple traditions create logical inconsistencies, and that's the best way we can explain these problems, that we're dealing with difficult or different traditions. All right. So as a memorial to these events, Moses renames Rephidim as Massah and Mariah, meaning test and quarrel. And the striking of the rock at Horeb with Moses' staff invokes another memory of God's deliverance from Egypt. Once again, the same staff doing the same type of miracles. The staff, of course, is a picture also of rulership and authority. And so in some way, it's telling the Israelites of a much later time to trust in God's governance, in his rulership, in his authority, held in the hand of humans, that will bring back prosperity, turn bitter waters into sweet waters, turn no waters or rocks into waters. It's a parable of admonishment, of encouragement, to appeal to their faith in Yahweh. All right, so God is still with them, and the same staff is still working miracles for them. Sandwiched between Elim and Rephidim, we have the never-ending complaining of the Israelites, right? They complain about not having food to eat, and they're always complaining to Moses about this. So God promises to provide them with bread from heaven and also some quality meat. This is another strange little portion, but according to Exodus 16:4, the bread is supposed to rain down from heaven daily, but according to verses 13 and 14, the bread is flaky, frost like dew on the morning ground. And the strangeness is dew doesn't fall, rain falls. So it's both these things, and fine. The point is, the story is saying that God miraculously provided some flaky type of substance. They don't really know what it is, and therefore they call it manna, because manna means we don't know what it means. We don't know what it is, right? Or actually, manna means what is this? So they're also not sure, but at least they have some food. But the food supply comes with rules. And this is interesting because one of the rules is that they can gather only for 6 days, because on the 7th day is the Sabbath and they're not allowed to gather anything on that day. Now, you might not look at that and think, oh, that's weird. And the reason for that is because you've read the rest of the story, but technically at this point, there is no Sabbath. The Sabbath hasn't been instituted. The Sabbath is something that happens a little bit later with the coming of the Ten Commandments. We also have the same type of theme in the Genesis 1 episode, where on the seventh day God rests. So traditionally we would read this and say, oh, this happened first. The seventh day God rests. That's something that happens first, and everybody knew about that. And that's possibly the reason why they had to rest on the seventh day while gathering manna. And that is because God would later institute the Sabbath, where all humans had to, all the Israelites had to rest. In reality, the truth is much closer to the opposite. That these things in Genesis 1 and this rule about the manna is something that came much later, and that was written back after the Sabbath was already practiced by the Israelites. And in some way, a lot of scholars believe that these stories are a way of legitimizing practices that were already in place in the Israelite life. Now, the Israelite Sabbath is something that's quite unique as far as I understand, from their neighbors or their ancestors. The resting on the seventh day is something that's quite peculiar to the Israelites. And these stories is the way that they justify these traditions as being instituted by God very early on before their time. All right. So, the Ten Commandments are not necessarily new commandments, of course. Let's just mention that very briefly. We understand that, for instance, something like an eye for an eye is not something new or unique to the Israeli people. In other words, growing up as a child in the church, I had this idea, because nobody ever really taught me otherwise, that at Mount Sinai at this time, possibly late second century, second millennium BC, the human race for the first time got this amazing law of eye for an eye, and it was given by Yahweh to God, and the Israelites got it, and so it kind of bled into the rest of the world. It's just the kind of idea that I grew up with. And unfortunately, it was just because out of absolute ignorance of what was actually going on in the world during that time. Because at school, I hated history. I loved maths and science and TD, technical drawing, but history, I dropped it as soon as I can. It was absolutely boring. I had absolutely no interest in it. And so it was easy for my views to be shaped just by the Bible or the biblical, or I'll go further and say by the Christian view on everything. In reality, once I started reading history, I realized that God's giving laws to kings or rulers did not start in the Bible and is predated in history. For instance, a good example is King Hammurabi of the Babylonians, who would be, as far as I know, one of the first laws that embodied eye for an eye justice in the ancient Mesopotamian world. In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that most of these laws are not new things. They are commonsensical things. You shall not kill, you shall not murder. It was absolutely not novel to any extent, to any stretch of the imagination. These are things that were part of the Mesopotamian world. And we'll talk about priesthood in a moment as well. It just turns out that we know now that the ancient Mesopotamian world was already a world steeped in law codes, temples, priesthoods, priests, gods that were warrior-like, storm gods that were riders on the clouds. These things were there already. And in reality, the Jewish idea of Yahweh and the giving of the Ten Commandments, and the idea of a temple or priesthood, they were really not novel at all. And in fact, they were newcomers on the block. And I think that's something that really hit me hard when I realized that the Jews and their views were really not novel at all. And maybe to some of you, you'd be like, oh, obvious, Franz. I mean, yeah, you know, that's common sense. But to me, it wasn't. to me, it shocked me, maybe as it might be shocking some of you as you're viewing this, but it's just not, it's not novel, and it's kind of new kids on the block. If you really think about when this was written down, um, Hammurabi law probably predates um, at least the writing of Exodus, but almost 1,000 years. I mean, it's it's a long time before that. And shockingly, I also discovered that many of the other ideas that I found in the Bible that I thought were absolutely unique to the Bible and came straight from God, bypassing all culture and history, straight into, downloaded into Moses's mind. Ideas like priesthood, of course, sacrifice, atoning sacrifices, first fruits giving, tithe givings. A lot of these things were already pre-existent in the human race, in the ancient Near East at least. And when you think about that long enough, you know, that's going to ruffle your feathers a little bit. Anyway, back to the Ten Commandments that we're going to be talking about probably only next time. But the point is, they weren't really new ideas, bar possibly the idea of the Sabbath. I'm not 100% sure about that, but as far as I know, the Sabbath was something that's quite unique to the Jews themselves. But the point here is just that the clear command of the Sabbath at this point in the story, as it pertains to the collection of manna, seems to be a little bit out of place, as the Ten Commandments was not given yet. And perhaps, as most scholars see this, this is another small piece of evidence that Exodus was written well after the time that it actually portrays, a time in which the Sabbath was already part of Israelite understanding and possibly practice. Now, throughout chapter 16, we see hints of the writer looking back at an earlier time. For example, and let me just say this at this point, I am mentioning all of these examples because it's in the larger body of these examples that one comes to the conclusion that this was written quite a long time after. This is not Moses sitting down every night and popping out a couple of Hebrew letters on a clay tablet or a papyrus. It just didn't happen like that. But anyway, some of the manna is to be put in a jar, and it needs to be placed before the covenant. Yo, hold on, what covenant? There's no covenant yet at this point. And what does this mean? And this is found in Exodus 16, verse 34. Alternatively, the word covenant here is translated as testimony. The covenant also is known as the Ark of the Covenant or the Ark of Testimony. But this artifact is only built in chapter 37. So it's small little pieces like this that tell us that the order seems to be a little bit out. This is not just someone writing down a little piece of, it's not someone journaling every night along the journey. Furthermore, verse 35 assumes that the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness are kind of over, and that the Israelites have already entered Canaan. Let me quote this verse 35 to you. The Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to the habitable land. They ate manna until they came to the border of Canaan. So once again, small piece that just tells us that was written from a much later time. Okay. And in verse 36, the writer feels the need to explain that an omer is a tenth of an ephah. So an omer was about 1.9 liters, and an ephah was about 19 liters. Omer is a much older measurement unit. And the fact that the reader, well, let me just say this, omer is only found once in the Bible, and it's here, where ephah is found multiple times and is actually used multiple times, because ephah was a much later measuring unit during this time. The fact that the author takes the time to explain what an omer is tells us that the writer is writing from a much later time when omers were not used anymore. Therefore, he explains it, right? It's kind of like me telling my story, my kids a story about my granddad buying a, I'm going to get this so wrong, but buying a hamburger for £0.50 in 1976. And then proceeding to explain to my kids what a pound is. The only reason why I would have to do that is because my kids no longer buy in pounds. That is one way to know that I'm telling them the story from a much later time. And that seems to be what we're dealing with here in Exodus. All right. Nevertheless, there's a war at the brink. Sorry, the Israelites are on the cusp of a war with the Amalekites. Suddenly, here after their departure from Egypt, they have an enemy, the Amalekites. And this we find in chapter 17, 8 to 16. Joshua leads the people into battle. Moses is on a hill, right? His hands have to be held in the air. The moment his hands drop, the Israelites start losing. So Aaron and his help are standing with Moses on this hill, keeping his hands up. One explanation for these mysterious, so many questions. How did the Israelites get weapons so early on? We can understand that from Egypt, they got valuables and clothes, as Exodus 3 and 12 tells us. But weapons are not mentioned in the loot that they take. And it would be really strange to think that the Egyptians will actually give them their weapons. So where did they find these weapons? Some Jewish interpreters believe that although it's not mentioned in Exodus, that the Israelites would have stripped the weapons off the bodies of the pursuing Egyptian chariots and horsemen that died in the Red Sea. Now, this is perfectly plausible. Is it probable? We will not really know. There's no mention made of it. So we just have to leave it there. The point is, they've got weapons and they're about to go and fight the Amalekites. Right. So there is, however, another explanation for why this is entered into the annals of Exodus. So this is from a little bit more of a skeptical viewpoint. Considering that this portion that follows, the war with the Amalekites or the fight with the Amalekites, is a little bit of anti-propagandist work against the later Amalekites who would become a great enemy of Israel. Now, we've seen this before, earlier on, when I did a portion on Genesis, where Noah's sons, Ham, Seth, and Japheth, I think they're called, seems to be early propagandist work against the future enemies of Israel. And from time to time, this type of thing crops up. And skeptics would say, and a lot of scholars actually hold this view, that this is later Israelites writing into their history books justification for considering the nations around themselves as enemies. They were enemies from the beginning. Ham was the guy, the Canaanites, we can annihilate them, we can destroy them, we can kill their children, their horses, their animals, their chicken, their women. We can destroy, annihilate them completely because Ham brought a curse upon them by looking at his dad naked. It seems to be that type of retrospective justification that's written in, for the reason that it just doesn't make sense that anyone thinking logically about the problem is not going to annihilate a whole nation because their great granddad saw his dad naked. It doesn't seem like it's just at all. But for them, it seems there was a curse that came, right? So once there's a curse, sorry, in the old ancient world, once you curse, that's it. We can kill you. No consequences, no problems. So the point is just that some see this as a bit of propaganda against the Amalekites. All right, so this is the alternate explanation. A later reality is once again poking its nose here, making its way into the book of Exodus. Centuries after the Exodus, the Amalekites will turn out to be the prominent enemies of Saul and David, right? So this is the heroes of Israel during the exile, of course, was David. Right? The other kings were all terrible, and nobody followed God like David. And if there was one like Hezekiah, he followed God like David. So David had become this legendary, although I guess we do believe he existed, but he became like a legendary figure. They romanticized David. They later on in the book of Chronicles, they would actually delete some of David's wrongdoings to paint a more romantic picture of this great hero of theirs. The Amalekites then becoming one of the main enemies of Saul and David. An alternative explanation for this story in Exodus is that from a later point of view, there had to be a reason why the Amalekites had to be annihilated and fought, and why they were the enemies of Israel. So what happens in this story, of course, is that right here at the birth of Israel, we seem to see a bit of anti-Amalekite propaganda. Verse 14 to 16 raise even more suspicions about the author's prejudice. Moses is lauded for vowing from there on out that the Amalekites will be Israel's sworn enemy, and their memory will be blotted out from under heaven. Now, after David defeats them, of course, we read from the later history, of course, we don't read about them again ever in the Old Testament. So it seems like the later writings of the Hebrew Bible, we actually see this annihilation of the Amalekites. They never mentioned again. They are removed from under heaven. Now, in my previous life, I would have seen that as a fulfillment of prophecy, but now I no longer see this as, oh, look here, in Exodus, this was promised, and boom, there it happened under David. I don't think that's what's going on. I think what's going on, it happened under David to some degree or the other, and it was written back into the history. And I think most critical scholars will view this as that. After David defeats them, we never ever read about them again in the Old Testament. Coincidence? Prophecy? Probably not. Probably retrospective anti-propaganda. But also here, let's get to the real issue. Why was the victory over the Amalekites dependent on the raised staff of Moses' hand in the first place? It seems a bit magic-like. It doesn't tell us that God told Moses to do this. Yeah, it's weird. If we read this about any other nation under any other god, we'd call it magic, folk magic. And in fact, people who look at this from a more neutral perspective probably interpret it like that as well. And we, as modern Christians, or not only modern Christians, but it seems like most Christians over the ages, whenever God does some form of magic, or whenever a form of magic happens inside of Christianity, we call it God is doing a mighty deed. But when other people do, where there's magic that doesn't get sanctioned by God, we call it black magic or evil magic or just magic per se. But it does seem that there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament that just looks like magic, that would have been akin to anything else you would have seen in the ancient world. For instance, the Urim and the Thummim was a way that we don't have a lot of knowledge about this, but it seemed to have been like a binary device with which the kings would inquire of God from the priests, right? So our most famous David seemed to have used this method quite a bit. So when we think about David inquiring from God to whether he should go fight or not go fight, we think in modern terms. David went to his inner chambers and he prayed and prayed and prayed, and God spoke to him and he went out and did it. But what most probably happened is he went and inquired from the priests, and I think there's some biblical evidence for this. He went to the priests, those who mediated between God and man, and they had some, if you're South African, I would call it a dolos. They had some form of a binary device that if it lands on this side, basically reduced to the flipping of a coin. If it lands like this, God says yes. If it lands like this, God says no. It seems to be like there was quite a lot of this going on in ancient Israel, and yet today we would frown. Christians would frown at this type of God speaking to them. And then you just think about that for a little bit, and then you realize that the New Testament Christians continued in this tradition. They chose the 12th disciple to replace Judas by casting lots, people. They were rolling the dice on who the next disciple is going to be. I'd like some Christians to roll the dice today and tell us that God told them. Because this seems to be quite clearly what was still happening in ancient Israel, even into the time of the first century, that there was this kind of belief that in the casting of lots, God will have his say. That I could say a lot about it, but it seems to be highly superstitious to me. But then again, I think of some Christians and how we today operate. They take the Bible flip through the pages, close their eyes, and point to a scripture and read it as if God is saying that to them now. Like these superstitions, just really, I've lost my appetite for these type of things, because they can be traced back to just simple pagan exercises. But for some reason, we think it's okay. I don't know. Anyway, the point here, how did I even get onto that? Oh, Moses got his hands up, and they win if his hands are up. They win if his hands are down. Anyway, let's carry on. The point here of the story for an ancient reader is that God is still with Moses and the Israelites. And as long as Moses and the Israelites obey, they will be victorious. And that would have been a parable or a lesson for an Israelite in exile that needed to return back to his land. Let's just obey God and everything will be fine, right? So, another of these very weird things, and this is a point at which I have realized that the Bible is not what we've made it to be. Because it's been telling us these things all along. We've read it, we've preached it, we've become so familiar with it that we no longer can recognize what it's actually saying to us. And this is the fact that Moses' government system in the wilderness is on the advice of a pagan priest. For heaven's sake, people, for heaven's sake, how would you like it if your pastor went to a witch today to find out how he should run his church? And came back to you and said, look, I know it's a witch, but hey, it gave me this amazing system, and I think we could operate on this system. Then you implement it and just carry on like nothing happened. And that's essentially what's going on here. Moses is he's overburdened by judging the people. In other words, by making decisions for them, ruling them. And he goes to a priest of Midian. Now, if you're a modern Christian, your belief would be that ancient gods were demons, right? Most Christians today believe this type of thing. So basically, the priest of a demon, the Midian god, I don't know what his name is at the moment, I can't recall, gives Moses advice and he implements it and it all works out fine. Like, what the heck is going on here? Well, I think what's going on here is that we have just become completely blind to the fact that Moses was absolutely okay with this, and Moses did not believe that the priest of Midian was the priest of some demon or some witch or some false god, but that Moses, if you take the story for what it says, actually was or did still believe, even though he had met Yahweh and believed in Yahweh, that there were many gods and that there was still value in the other gods, although he was commanded to follow Yahweh only. I think that's the clearest, simplest understanding of what's actually going on here. Now, for most of us, especially for me, this was an unacceptable conclusion, and I avoided it like the plague. But eventually I had to just confront this and realize that Moses was not a Christian. He didn't think like we think. He was an ancient person who believed in many gods, of which his God Yahweh was the one to be worshipped by Moses and the Israelites. But there was value in what the other gods' priests commanded or advised. Now, it goes even further than this, because the number 70 is a number we find in the Bible. We find it in the number of elders in Israel. We find it in almost the perfect number of forgiveness. We find it in Daniel, 70 disciples in the New Testament. There was another 70 somewhere. I can't recall exactly where. But the point is that this number had a lot of significance in the ancient world. As far as I know, we know from some Ugaritic literature that in the Canaanite pantheon, there were those called kind of like the Elohim, or the sons of God, and they were literally the sons of El and his consort, what's she called? Astaroth, not Ishtar. Yeah, it might have been Ishtar, but there's another word for it. It sounds similar. Excuse me. But anyway, their children were 70, and that these 70 gods were the sons of the true one almighty God El. They kind of ruled the world, etc. And there's a lot of allusions to this in our Psalms, for instance. Not a topic for today. But that's the second thing that's really troubling here, is this number 70 is not just any number. It's something that's deeply ingrained in ancient mythology. Yeah, and you don't know these things unless you read wider than the Bible. The point, I think, here is just to realize that their world was not our world. They didn't think like us. The things that are absolutely taboo to Christians today were not taboo to Moses. Moses was probably not a monotheist in the way that we think about monotheism, even as he is described by a people who write during a time where there was a strong monotheistic thrust in the 6th and 5th centuries within Israel. Anyway, there you go. What's even further troubling is that the people of Israel of the 6th and 7th and 5th centuries were not troubled by this either. So it tells you a little bit about their view on other gods and advice from pagan priests. They just didn't see it like we see it today, and it's something we need to come to terms with. All right, let's leave that at that. All right. So let me just read this. The strangest part of the story is that the governing structure of Israel is the brainchild of a Midian priest called Jethro, which is his father-in-law, right? We know now that much of Israelite culture, and this is something you are going to encounter if you decide to start reading historically, culturally, theologically on the roots of ancient Israelite religion. You're going to find this theme over and over and over and over again. And this is this. Much of Israelite culture and religion their development was influenced by ancient Canaanite, Mesopotamian culture and religion. And this is something which it's highly unsettling. It was highly unsettling to me when I first looked at this. And now I just realized that this is the most probable truth about how their religion evolved. And it's just something we need to deal with. Now, it is also probably not a coincidence that the mountain of Yahweh is down in the south at Midian somewhere, close to Jethro, and who knows what the connection between Jethro and Yahweh could have been. As far as we know, as far as I've been able to trace it, the idea, the first mention of Yahweh comes from the very south of the Levant, or of Canaan. So it seems no coincidence that in this area, maybe this god was known by Jethro. I'm not sure about, we don't really know fully, but there seems to be some southern connection with the name of Yahweh, the god that comes from the mountain in the south. But anyway, let's leave it at that. Okay, now, we want to get to Sinai. So, they eventually arrived at Sinai. Wherever this is the mountain where Moses met God the first time. This is the mountain of the burning bush, and the place where now the Israelites is going to encounter God in a way that they've not. They are going to receive commandments. They are going to miss the boat completely. And this is one of the most interesting parts about the Exodus chapters, is this idea of the golden calf. And what has that got to do with anything? Why are the Israelites building a golden calf? They've just seen all this miraculous stuff happen. How in the world can they now build a calf and say, these are your gods that brought you out of Egypt? It doesn't make sense to us, but I think that if we look at it from a historical point of view, that will make a whole lot more sense. So I'm going to leave that for next time. I'm going to leave you with this today. The journey from Exodus to Sinai was plagued with loss of water, a lot of bemoaning of Moses, which he always had to take to God, to the point where he has to go and ask advice from a pagan priest. Now, what's really strange to me is Moses could hear God so clearly, but he has to ask a pagan priest how to solve the problem of judging the Israelites. Like, I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, I'll see you next week. Cheers. Thanks.